recognized.
Thank you. I'm honored today to speak in support of my legislation, the Protecting Against Child Exploitation Act, which aims to close a court-created loophole and, as the title suggests, further protect our children from predators. When I first arrived to Congress after almost 20 years of litigating constitutional law cases and drafting legislation for municipalities to control the proliferation of sexually oriented businesses, I was deeply concerned to learn that this particular loophole even existed in current federal law, which essentially allows a child rapist to admit to sexually abusing a child and yet still evade punishment. The background is important to reiterate. As my chairman stated moments ago, this comes from a 2015 case, U.S. versus Palomino Coronado, where the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit reversed the conviction of a child sex offender simply because the court determined the perpetrator lacked specific intent to record the disgusting images that were found on the offender's smartphone. This is despite the fact that the defendant admitted to sexually abusing the 7-year-old child from next door and memorializing the conduct. In its opinion, the court decided the lack of purpose or specific intent was enough to overturn the conviction, even though the defendant himself took the photo of the heinous act and subsequently admitted to sexually abusing this child. This is absolutely in clear contradiction of our responsibility and this Congress's intention to protect America's children. In Scripture, Romans 13 refers to the governing authorities as, quote, God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. And I, for one, believe we have a moral obligation, and as any just government should, to defend the defenseless. My legislation presents a simple fix and updates Title 18 of the U.S. Code to ensure future defendants are not able to circumvent the law by simply claiming a lack of intent, especially after knowingly creating a depiction of a minor engaged in sexually explicit conduct. More specifically, my legislation amends Section 2251 of Title 18 to prohibit the production and transmission of a visual depiction of a real minor engaged in sexually explicit conduct. Furthermore, it amends current law to include prohibiting the depiction of a minor assisting any person in engaging in a sexually explicit act. Lastly, to clarify potential circumstances of misinterpretation of the statute and to ensure the statute is not used erroneously to prosecute Internet service providers when they've not engaged in wrongdoing, my legislation emphasizes that to be criminally liable under Section A3, an Internet service provider must have actual knowledge that the child pornography is on its server and that it must intentionally transmit that image or intentionally cause its transmission. We also take the step of prohibiting any criminal or civil liability for Internet service providers who are required to transmit child pornography to law enforcement in response to a legal process, such as a search warrant and child exploitation cases. Of course, we would never anticipate a prosecution of an Internet service provider for merely responding to a legal process. But it's my hope that explicitly providing for this immunity in the statute will further enhance the relationship between Internet service providers and law enforcement to work together to combat these predators. In answer to the opposition that we've heard here, it's important to reiterate this legislation does not create new mandatory minimums. However, I'd like to address the comments regarding the current law on mandatory minimum penalties under the production of child pornography statute. There is simply no evidence that federal prosecutors are abusing this statute, and I think we should all recognize that producing child pornography is a horrific crime. It often means luring young children into acts that no one, man, woman, or child, should be forced to do. It is not a photograph of a nude child. It is something far worse. Each photo is a crime scene. A horrific act by the perpetrator requires the maximum amount of legal deterrence. While mandatory minimums have reached much scrutiny in the drug statutes, in this venue, for this statute, there can be no doubt that the penalties that exist under current law are appropriate. Child sexual exploitation is vastly underreported. The number of images of child pornography keeps growing, and the images are becoming more and more depraved. The harm is too great to these victims not to have significant penalties available to deter this conduct and punish the producers of child pornography. Every time an image of child pornography is viewed, the victim gets re-victimized. Once an image is on the Internet, it is irretrievable and can continue to circulate forever. This permanent record of a child's sexual abuse can alter his or her life forever. Many victims of child pornography suffer from feelings of helplessness, fear, humiliation, and lack of control, given that their images are available for others to view in perpetuity. These images are becoming more sadistic and violent, and the age of the average victim is becoming younger and younger. It is a horrifying fact that is not uncommon for even toddlers and infants to now be subjects of these images. It's also important that there's no confusion about one fact. The very creation of these images is repulsive, regardless of whether or not the abuse was done with a specific intent of creating an image, or if the intent to memorialize this conduct was a secondary thought. Consider the facts of the case that led to this bill. As was mentioned, an adult male had sexual relations with a 7-year-old girl that lived next door and decided to photograph it. That is the production of child pornography. There's no question about it. No one should be permitted to escape responsibility merely by asserting they did not have the specific intent to create the image before they abused the child. The act of taking a photo or making a video is enough to demonstrate intent. Mr. Speaker, that's what this bill does. It is appropriate that we are doing all this on the day that we recognize as National Missing Children's Day, and I'm going to urge all my colleagues to support the bill. With that, reserve the balance of my time.